I want to go over a quick about 10 minutes of a recent Duran video. So the folks at the Duran did a video reviewing, okay, they reviewed all of what's been going on with Russia's defense planning, what they're planning as the next phase of this conflict, and what it means. And so Alexander Mercouris over at the Duran is going to describe this. And so I want to play this for you just to warm up, just to get started here. I want to play this and then comment on it, because I think it's very important, and it points to something I want to definitely get to after they finish up here. I'm going to play about a little under 10 minutes here, and I'm going to stop it for comments as well. So keep liking the video. You know what to do. Like the video, subscribe to this channel, keep boosting it. All right, here we go.
The pace of decision making in Moscow here has been intense. So we had on the 21st of December, we had first a Security Council meeting. This is the top political leadership of Russia. Then we had this colossal meeting of the board or collegium of the Russian Ministry of Defense. That's the entire Russian military leadership. 15,000 people apparently were involved at various levels. We had reports from Putin. We've had reports from the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. The following day, we had a report from the chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov. He briefed foreign military attaches in Moscow. And we've had another press conference from Putin. And you can put this all together, and a number of things come across. Putin says, again, he said this now several times, that the West's objective is to destroy Russia, to dismember it, that Russia, therefore, is in a state of confrontation with the West. This is going to be an enduring and long-lasting one. And the Russians, therefore, have been pushed into a position where they have no choice but to remilitarize.
So essentially, I mean, I agree with this assessment. Russia has been remilitarizing, and it's for this exact reason. So you always hear in the Western media that the Russians, right? The Russian, these big bad Russians, they're just in this Ukraine fight just because this is an unprovoked invasion. They're invading Ukraine. There's no reason for any of this. Their whole their militarization, everything they're doing militarily, is just aggressive and it's offensive. Well, the fact of the matter is, and I think Alexander is exactly right, that Russia is not preparing for a battle in Ukraine. Russia is preparing for a long war with NATO. This is becoming so much more clear as time goes by. But arguably, this was the case from the very beginning, because immediately, right, when Russia decided to wage a special military operation, you had NATO become full circle involved in this conflict. It had already been involved training Ukrainian military personnel, funneling weapons even before the conflict began. But once it did, NATO increased and escalated that support. And so it's been quite obvious, and you've heard Sergei Shoigu, who's the top military brass in Russia. You've heard Sergei Lavrov say this, the foreign minister, that this is a war with NATO, essentially. This is not just a military operation in Ukraine against Ukraine, but Ukraine is really just serving as a proxy for NATO. And so Russia, yes, is remilitarizing for these purposes that Russia now actually has, unlike after the fall of the Soviet Union, where it was thought that Russia was just some now dismembered puppet of the West. That's no longer the reality on the ground. The reality is that the West, through its major military bloc, NATO, and the United States being at the head of that bloc, they view Russia as something to dismember, as a country that they need to conduct regime change against.
And this is going to be a military build-up on an enormous scale. Another 500,000 men joining the Russian army, 10 motorized rifle divisions being created. This is, 3 are completely new, 7 will be developed out of brigades. There's going to be more emphasis on strategic weapons, more emphasis on the Air Force, but the priority is now going to be the ground forces. As I said, 10 motorized infantry divisions, two new military districts in Moscow and in the Leningrad region, that's the area that surrounds St. Petersburg, a new army corps to be created opposite Finland in Karelia. Um, uh, I'm sorry, the beefing up of Russian tank divisions and tank forces, and this wasn't fully spelled out. A massive expansion of the Russian army, two more air assault divisions. Now, the Soviet Union had 7 paratroop divisions. Russia is now going to have 6, but supplementing those 6 paratroop divisions, there's going to be all kinds of independent air mobile brigades and all that kind of thing. So ultimately, Russia's airborne forces will probably outnumber those which the Soviet Union deployed. And 5 naval infantry divisions replacing naval infantry brigades. And the other thing was an enormous increase in Russian military production. And Putin is talking about the fact that military production increased very significantly in 2022, but that it's going to increase by orders of magnitude in 2023 and beyond.
So, does this sound like a country, Russia, that is struggling to uh, to fight this military operation, this conflict in Ukraine militarily? Because that's actually what we've been hearing of late. That Russia's in trouble. Russia can't produce the weapons that it needs. Russia, Russia, Russia. It's pure projection because we've already covered on this channel that it's actually the United States and NATO that have incredible issues right now with its production lines. That militarily, they're kind of out. They're kind of out of weapons. They've run out. The well has run dry militarily because Ukraine has essentially blown all of it with just absolute incredible pace, like at an alarming rate. That's how these Western military experts, that's how the Pentagon describes it. So Russia seems like it's building up. You heard Alexander Mercouris there, to a point greater than the Soviet Union. And remember, during the Soviet era, during the Cold War, the first Cold War, there were real military threats that the Soviet Union was very concerned about, not least the fact that the so-called Marshall Plan, right, the establishment of NATO in 1949, all of that was to build up a kind of European if you think about this so-called military alliance against the axis of evil during the War on Terror. Think about the Cold War as being one big effort by the United States to try to mobilize anything and anyone that it could, any nation that it could, any force that it could, to dismember the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union had a lot of reasons to be concerned. That's why there was a massive arms race. Reagan helped both try to establish the disarmament of the entire situation, because for a lot of selfish reasons, but also escalated it in other ways as modern technology grew. So you had this thread throughout the Cold War era of the United States jockeying with the Soviet Union over arms, because the Soviet Union actually did have real threats. The Soviet Union is often portrayed kind of like China is now, kind of like Russia is now. You have a lot of liberals out there who think Russia is the Soviet Union now, and you have a lot of people thinking China is just like the Soviet Union was, or is just like Maoist China, or however people want to portray it. But what the image that gets conjured is just this rabidly aggressive country trying to spread its communist tentacles everywhere. And the reality is that the Soviet Union really didn't fight many. It didn't, other than Afghanistan, where it was again provoked into, it was really provoked, right? And Zbigniew Brzezinski admitted that, right? In a lot of his books, he said, and in interviews, he said that the United States gave the Soviet Union its Vietnam by provoking it into Afghanistan in the late 1970s, beginning in 1979 under Jimmy Carter, when the United States funded the Mujahideen. So the Soviet Union often was provoked into wars, often felt that it had to support, right, African liberation movements in Latin America, but more so African liberation movements. You also had the Soviet Union come in and try to and help support Vietnam, right, in the war of aggression there, led by the United States, Korea. So the Soviet Union often felt like it had to support other other efforts of war because there was wars of aggression going on, and the Soviet Union felt very threatened by that. That's why we had that nuclear buildup that occurred, because the Soviet Union was very well aware that the two A bombs, the two atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in 1945, were actually meant to show the Soviet Union what the United States could do militarily, because the United States was already thinking about the next war. It was already thinking about the Soviet Union. So I just want to add that context there, because now what Alexander is saying is there's a remilitarization to a scale beyond the Soviet Union, which seems almost unheard of, given that you would think we were in a different political situation. But actually, what we're finding is even though Russia is technically smaller, it's not the Soviet Union anymore, doesn't really have that same character that it had then. But because Russia is rising again, right? It might be a little smaller. It might not have the Soviet republics aligned with it in the same way, but it is rising. It is becoming more of a military power and economic power, and one that honestly doesn't follow U.S. diktats in a lot of ways. Now there is this big buildup by Russia because it feels threatened by the by NATO, by this NATO enlargement, this NATO encirclement. That's a word we don't hear often, NATO encirclement, but that's exactly what's happening. It's exactly what's happening in this region toward Russia. But let's continue.
And he said, we have the financial resources to do it. Our economy is in good shape. We're fully capable of doing this. We don't need to do what the Soviet Union did, which is militarize our entire society and militarize our entire economy, because we have the resources, we have the factories, we have the scientists, we have the engineers, we have the laboratories, we have all of these things, and we have the production facilities going as well. So the West is now in an arms race in Europe. It's going to face a Russian military juggernaut, which is heading its direction, because that's be absolutely clear what's coming, and it's going to squash Ukraine in its path.
I mean, now that's an assessment. It's going to squash Ukraine in its path. And we have a little bit more to go, about a couple more minutes. But I just want to stop it there, because that also, we don't hear that as well. We are hearing now that Russia is going to lose. Russia is losing. You have this big coronation of Zelensky in Congress. You have the Western mainstream media constantly propagandize about how bad Russia is doing, and that it's only a matter of time before Russia falls. But if you read closely in the Western corporate media, if you read closely, you see that actually the opposite is true, and they even admit it. The Pentagon is admitting it. They all know that this is a war of attrition. This is a war that will continue to go on and on and on for as long as NATO is willing, as long as the United States is willing to throw all of its marbles at it, to throw everything it has at it. Sure, it can continue, but it's not going to it's not going to eliminate Russia. It's not going to lead to regime change for Russia. It won't. It won't. I mean, that's not going to happen here. And so really the purpose of the Ukraine proxy war has already been rejected. They've already lost, essentially. NATO has already lost, the United States has already lost. It's just a matter of how much losses they are willing to incur globally, whether it's the economic losses, whether it's fighting to the last Ukrainian, right? It's just a matter of time. But all we hear in the Western corporate media is that no, actually, Russia is the one that's losing. And the truth is, of course, far different. That is a reversal of the truth. That's what we would call a lie. So let's continue. Let's end this.
Right. So there's going to be a war between NATO and Russia. That's pretty
Well,
much what's going to happen.
well, this
Maybe
is
after
what
Ukraine. Who
Yeah.
knows how long after Ukraine? But I mean, there is no other option.
Yeah.
Either NATO dissolves and the European Union breaks up, or there's a conflict. And the reason that Russia is building up their forces around Moscow and St. Petersburg is obvious. I mean, St. Petersburg, they're preventing what could be a threat from Finland. That's obvious, and then all of these states over there in Moscow, the same. I mean, that would be the only reason to do all these things.
No, I mean
But NATO. There is no other course for NATO. That's my point. There is no other course for NATO.
well,
Because
what is
if NATO stops, if NATO stops in Ukraine, then there is no need for NATO. So NATO has to continue to push towards Russia. Where else is it going to push towards? Latin America, towards
yeah.
the Pacific?
It's so funny because Alex laughs there. He's like, where else? Latin America or the Pacific? And actually, there are these NATO sociopaths, these antisocial personalities, these absolutely bloodthirsty warmongers inside of NATO. Really, they're US imperial operatives, of course, that actually do think like this. So Alex is laughing because it is absurd, right? NATO is supposed to be stationed in the so-called North Atlantic, Europe, right? The US, right? This kind of North Atlantic alliance. And it's looking actually toward the Pacific, right? Because this June, what did NATO do? It said, well, we're going to meet in our summit, NATO summit, and we're going to talk about how we want to include China as a malicious actor that now NATO has to become more involved in containing, right? Literally just spewing being a mouthpiece and spewing the bile of the Biden administration and of the U.S. geopolitical imperial policy of trying to contain China. That's what is happening. And so he's laughing. It's absurd. and it's true. Everything he said here was true. Yes, there is, this is really that existential. If NATO doesn't continue to expand into Ukraine, absorb Ukraine, admit Ukraine at some point, maybe at some point in the future, where else is it going to go? NATO has basically expanded to the point, right, over the last 30 years to the point where it really doesn't have much. There's no other options here. And Russia has not been weakened by this. Actually, it could be argued that the more NATO encircles Russia, the stronger Russia's political legitimacy becomes. The stronger that Vladimir Putin becomes, the stronger that the United Russia Party becomes. And why? Well, think about what happened in Syria. Syria was invaded by a consortium of imperialist countries led by the United States starting in 2011. What happened to Syria's leadership, the Ba'ath Party and Bashar al-Assad? They became stronger. Why? Well, now they were defending themselves against a foreign invader, against an imperialist invader. Actually, not just one imperialist invader, but all of NATO and all of their proxies, all, and you had all these armed groups, Al-Qaeda affiliates funded and backed by NATO, by these Arab proxies, by these monarchies, right? You had that happening. Israel was also involved, as they always are. So actually, the Ba'ath Party got stronger because people in Syria united around it, no matter what their differences were. Most people in Syria said, well, we got to go behind our government because our government is the only force strong enough to preserve our sovereignty. And I believe that's what has been happening in Russia to a much larger scale, because Russia is a bigger country than Syria just in terms of its economic and military and political influence. So let's continue, because Alexander's going to say something that I want to close the segment on and analyze more, because it's something that I've been arguing for many years now. So here we go.
Push towards Russia. Well, that's it.
Well, there is a more practical problem, which is perhaps the one that really is going to worry the Pentagon especially, which is that we have a overcommitments crisis. Now, I've been reading articles. There was an article, very interesting article in The Guardian, which I shared with you, which said, we can only send one Patriot missile battery to Ukraine, and we've got to worry about, the Ukrainians mustn't use too many Patriot missiles because we don't have enough. We're already short of these things. We don't have enough weapons to confront China and to confront Iran. We're too thinly stretched in too many places. And you're hearing this all the time from source after source after source. Now, they've been able to keep things together up to now because, well, the Russians scaled down their military to a huge extent after the end of the Cold War, with the Russian military now building up again, and as I said, moving through Ukraine ever closer now to the old Soviet borders. Because be very clear, it's clear to me that that is what is going to happen, and they're going to integrate Ukraine's current resources into their own. I mean, three of these divisions are going to be based in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, which, bear in mind, the Russians are already talking about now, well, regard already now as part of their own country. Well, with all of this, what does NATO do? Because they're facing this military juggernaut coming at them from the east, which they provoked into existence by pushing NATO eastwards all the time. And of course, they have this massive Chinese buildup now in the Pacific, which is gearing up and getting stronger all the time. Now, before the Ukraine conflict began, I did a number of programs on my channel talking about this commitments crisis that NATO has and the US has, and it's just got massively worse. So what do they do? Do they do what you said? Go for broke. Try and take on the Russians fast before this Russian build-up is completed. That was what happened to a great extent at the start of the First World War. The Russians, in the period just before the First World War, started a major rearmament and military build-up program because they began to perceive a threat from Germany. By 1920, they would have been superior in pretty much every military element to Germany. So the Germans panicked, and instead of seeking peace with the Russians, they rushed into war with the Russians instead in 1914. It's partly my take, but it's one that a lot of academic historians have. That's what started the First World War. German panic about the growth of Russian military power. Do we do the same? After all, that ended in disaster for the Germans. And of course, today we have nuclear weapons thrown in. Or do we seek peace? I mean, the choice is ours. You ask me whether people in Washington are able to seek peace. I don't know. I mean, I don't see any sign of it at the moment. But that is the dilemma we're going to be facing in the West before very long.
So that's the end of the segment I wanted to play. One thing I will clarify, though, is here's my analysis of that, because I agree with Alexander Mikuris wholeheartedly. The empire is outstretched, and the United States and NATO, I'll just think of them interchangeably, because NATO is really the United States. NATO is just an expression, an extension of U.S. imperial power. It's just one way that it can build up and pursue its strategy, right? That's what NATO is. But this is something I've been talking about for years, and I think that we need to broaden out what it means for the United States to be outstretched as an empire. Because militarily, this is definitely a big problem for the US. And so you all know, we covered it here on this show. What's the new military budget? $858 billion. That's about to be passed. If it wasn't already, Joe Biden's going to sign it very soon. And it's going to contain, $45 billion more dollars in military aid to Ukraine after the whole Zelensky visit. And much of this is going to this military theater, this military encirclement campaign toward Russia and China, right? A lot of the money goes there. Many people don't know that actually the Indo-Pacific Command is the largest command center of the U.S. military, and it actually contains something upward of 50% of all of the U.S.'s military assets and 60% of all of its naval assets. So you're talking about, just in this campaign against China alone, you have much of the military geared toward that, much of the U.S.'s military power geared in that direction. And then we're not even including, right, CENTCOM, and the U.S. is still overbloated and oversized, while a lot of it is outsourced privately, and a lot of it is now in the hands of special military operations. I mean, special operations, right? Special ops, that kind of thing, JSOC. This, no, regardless of that, you still have a pretty sizable, right? You have the U.S. military occupying a third of all of Syria, so you do have a sizable military portion there. Then you have Africa. You have the United States trying to expand into the African continent. The U.S. Africa Command now, I think, is in all but 2 countries with logistical operations, military operations happening there. I think there are military bases in somewhere between 20 to 30 African countries now. You have just an extremely large military footprint by the United States. And now you have one single country, one singular country, one of the poorest in Europe, that was a former Soviet republic. Its nation statehood is about what, 30 years old. You have this single country, this single puppet regime. Literally, the only reason this government exists and is acting the way it does is because of a U.S. sponsored coup. Now that puppet regime is asking for more military equipment than what exists in all of NATO's stockpiles altogether, right? Ukraine has blown through that.